We've been talking about the last few weeks Yahweh versus all the false gods of Satan. Tonight we're going to continue talking about Yahweh versus the Philistine gods. Remember the Philistine people that lived on the coast, Gaza, Ashdod, Ashkelon, all these cities, Gath, the coastal cities of Israel. And they had their own set of gods, also obviously that Satan ginned up for the Philistine people. Last time we looked at the story of Dagon. Remember the Ark of the Covenant? It was captured by the Philistines and they took it into this temple of this god called Dagon, and they offered their god Dagon. The Philistines offered them the Ark of the Covenant of Yahweh. And that night Dagon fell on his face and they propped their god back up as if he wasn't strong enough to take care of himself. The next day they woke up and he had fallen again, but this time his head was cut off, and so were his hands. All that was left was his torso. Interesting, because tonight we're going to see a Philistine who taunts the living God. We're going to see his head chopped off in the same way that Yahweh himself chopped the false god's head off, Dagon. We're going to see Yahweh's man for the job, the young, ruddy, handsome David, cut off the head of Goliath, the giant who taunts the armies of the living God, Yahweh. It's still Yahweh against Satan, always has been. And until Yahweh does away with Satan and casts him into the lake of fire, it always will be God versus Satan. The counterfeits, the true loveliness of our God versus the counterfeits of Satan. Right now we're simply seeing Satan's counterfeits in the land of Philistia, the Philistine false gods. The second story we're going to look at tonight, I don't know if we'll finish it, I doubt it, but we're going to look at King David before he was king, as a young man, a young teenage boy, as he fights a Philistine giant. We all know his name, Goliath. But we have to look at this man, David. He's going to be introduced here. In a couple of weeks, we're going to see him in the first hour as we get to 1 Samuel chapter 17. But as introduction to what's coming in a couple of weeks, look at who David is. What do we know about this young boy that steps on the scene to fight God's battle for him here? David is the great man who will say the battle is the Lord's. But don't lose sight as we go through this, God uses prepared men. And even though Yahweh fights the battle, it's David's arm that swings the sling. They're both active. God is active in defeating the Philistine gods that Goliath represents, and David is also active. He's the shepherd who had learned over years how to sling a stone with a sling. They're both active. But who is this young boy David? He's Jesse's youngest son. Jesse had 7 sons, or 8 sons probably. In some of the captions in the Bible it says David had 7 sons. In other verses it says David had 8 sons, and you wonder, well, which is it? And I think it's 8. I think that idea of 7 being the number of completion is almost poetic in saying David had a complete family. He had 7 children. So he's Jesse's youngest son. I'm sorry if I said David. Jesse has 8 kids. David is the youngest. I'll give you more timeline about David on Sunday morning. But he's a young man here. Probably 17 years old in this story. Probably a very good number. He was probably 12 years old. Imagine this. I'll give you part of the timeline. David was probably 12 years old when he was called into service as a harp player, a 10-stringed harp. He was probably 12 years old when he was called into service for King Saul and his evil spirit that would come upon him. He was a kid. 5 years or so have gone by, and David is now still obviously the youngest of his father Jesse, but David is a teenager now, probably 17 years old, when he faces almost a 10-foot tall human being, Goliath. He's a man from Bethlehem. Jesse is from Bethlehem. You'll often hear this phrase, the city of David, in the Old Testament. Let me ask you a question. This is a trick question. But when the Bible says the city of David, this occurred in the city of David, what city is the Old Testament referring to? I hear Jerusalem. What other city might you think that is the city of David? Joseph went to be counted because he was of the people of David, and Joseph, the man who raised Jesus Christ, went to Bethlehem, the city of David, to be counted in the census. There are two cities in the Bible that are called the city of David. One of them is Bethlehem, the city of the house of bread is what this word means. Beit means house and lechem is bread. So Jesse was from the house of bread. David was from the house of bread, and so was Jesus Christ, the bread of life, from the house of bread, from Bethlehem. So David, when you hear the phrase the city of David, it refers not only to Bethlehem, but based on context, what is this story about? It can also, and most times, refers to the city of Jerusalem, the city of David. He's a shepherd. When Jesse goes to, when Samuel, as we'll see in 1 Samuel 16, when Samuel, and we'll see this on Sunday morning in a couple of days, when Samuel goes to find the next king because Saul has been rejected as being king, Samuel goes to the house of Jesse in Bethlehem, and Jesse starts parading his children, all his boys, in front of Samuel, but there's one missing, the youngest, the shepherd, the lowly 12-year-old kid. I mean, how can a 12-year-old be a king, right? This kid, the shepherd of the family, is out tending the sheep. That's David. So he is the shepherd of his father's sheep, young David. He's also, we know from the Bible, he's ruddy. The Bible calls him reddish. There's only one other man in the Old Testament. There's only one other Jew who is described as being reddish or ruddy. Do you know who he is? Who is he? Who? It's Esau. It's Esau, the twin brother of Jacob. Abraham's son Isaac, Isaac's wife Rebekah had twin sons in her womb, Jacob and Esau. It's Esau that Jacob came in. Remember, he's starving. He'd been out. His brother is making this lentil stew, or this stew, this reddish looking stew. And they make a deal for the birthright. I'll give you the birthright. I need stew. I got the story mixed up. It's Esau that came in. Jacob is the one that was making the stew. But Esau said, I'll give you my birthright for some stew. I'm starving. Give me the food. Well, this man was also hairy and ruddy. He was light complected. He was reddish, probably freckled, probably had red hair, reddish blonde, strawberry blonde, whatever. That's what David looked like. That's also what Esau looked like. Esau took on a nickname because of his look. His nickname was Edom. And Edom means red. What was that man's name in the garden created from the dust of the earth? What was his name? It was Adam. A-D-A-M, not E-D-O-M, but the consonants are the same. Adam was a reddish man. The word means red man. That's what Adam means. That's who Esau was. He was a reddish man. And when we get to King David, he's the next Jew and the last Jew who we see described as reddish in complexion, which is interesting because if you know anything about a Middle Eastern Jew, what did they look like? What do they look like? Look at them on TV. Pre-diaspora, you go way back into Israel, and these are dark-skinned people. They're olive-skinned. They're not white people. They're not European. They're Middle Eastern. They look much more like I do than Don Smith does. They are olive-skinned, dark-haired, curly, dark brown, blackish-haired, dark brown-eyed people. That's what the historical Jews looked like, except for this kid David. He was ruddy. He was a good-looking man according to the Scripture. He was handsome by all accounts. He was very, very intelligent. The Bible says that he's a warrior. When Saul, when his wise men are looking for someone to play for him, play music, David is described as a warrior, a musician, and we know that he's also a poet who wrote 90 of the Psalms. David did. He's a musician on his harp. He's a poet. He's a wonderful poet. He's a great writer. He ends up being a wonderful warrior for Israel. David is the man who, this young man who's going to take on this Goliath, this giant. And the last fact here, he's a young boy when he arrives on the scene. When he arrives on the scene in 1 Samuel chapter 16 and he's anointed king, based on all the other information that you can piece together of David's lifetime and David's reign, he was probably a 12-year-old kid when Samuel went and found the shepherd and anointed him with God's oil and said, "You will be the next king of Israel." Remember Sunday morning I asked, how long was it between the time that Samuel anointed David as king? How long went by before David actually takes the throne as king from Saul? It's a 15 to 20 year period of time. This 12-year-old boy can't become an active and successful king. He has to grow up. So probably 15 to 18 to 19 years go by from 1 Samuel 16 to when David finally takes the throne. The 12-year-old has become a 30-year-old man. According to the Scriptures, David was 30 years old when he took the throne. According to, I could show you a Bible verse, I will Sunday morning. According to the Scriptures, David was 30 years old when he took the throne, and he reigned in Israel for 40 years. So we have some really good numbers on David. He was a kid. He was a kid when he showed up on the scene. By the time we get to the fight with Goliath, 4 or 5 years has gone by. He's 16 or 17 years old. Just a quick couple of verses about David, the greatness of David and why David was a man after God's own heart. This is what 1 Kings 15 has to say about this boy, this man, the life of King David. In 1 Kings 15 it says, "But for David's sake, because of the man he was, because of his character, because of the way he lived with Yahweh, the relationship he had with God, for David's sake, Yahweh his God gave him a lamp in Jerusalem. He tore the kingdom away from Solomon, but he left Judah and Benjamin in the south for David's sake." That's the lamp. He left Jerusalem and he left 2 tribes in the south. Because David, why did God choose to do that? Because David did what was right in the sight of Yahweh. After everything David did, and we know the story of David without retelling the sins of David, after everything David did, when God looked at his whole life, he was a man after God's own heart because he never turned. Look what it says. He had not turned aside from anything that God commanded him all the days of his life, except that one little problem he had with Uriah the Hittite and his wife Bathsheba. That doesn't mean David never sinned on any other day of his life. That's not what it means, but those were his big sins. The taking of a married woman and the murder of her husband Uriah the Hittite. But in God's estimation, David did what was right. He was loyal to the worship of Yahweh, the one true God, and he never turned aside from it. Goliath. Turn to 1 Samuel chapter 17 with me. Now I know we won't get through this story, but let's look at it. Goliath, this giant from Gath, this Philistine man. Philistia is the name of the area, the country, the nation, if you will. And Gath or Gat is one of the cities, one of the 5 main cities of the area known as Philistia. In 1 Samuel 17 verse 1, this is what it says. Now the Philistines, there's a war that's brewing. The Philistines gathered their armies for battle. They were gathered at Socoh, which belongs to Judah. So the Philistines had moved out of Philistia and were in the land of Judah. They camped between Socoh and Azekah in Ephes Damim. Verse 2 says, so we know the Philistines are prepared for battle. Their armies are ready for battle. They are in the land of Judah, in the territorial land of the people of Judah. Verse 2 gives you the other side of the war. Saul and the men of Israel, they were gathered and camped in the valley of Elah, and they also drew up in battle array to fight, to encounter the Philistines. Just a couple of pictures here. These are actual pictures that I took of the valley of Elah. This is the valley. You can see that it's not a very deep valley. The hills on either side of it aren't deep, but here's the valley right here. This is one of the hillsides going up here, and this is the other hillside. So you've got the Philistines on one side, and you've got the Jews on another side, and every morning Goliath would come out from the hills and stand in the valley and proclaim to the Jews, someone come out and fight me. You cowards, someone come and stand man to man. If you kill me, then the Philistines will serve you as servants. If I kill your soldier, then you will serve us as slaves and servants. But someone come out and fight me. And he did that for 40 days in a row until David showed up on the scene. So this is the array here, just to show you another picture. This is looking backwards at this hillside right here. I'm down here right about the ledge here, looking back up where either the Philistines or the Jews were. I don't know which one. But the hills aren't very high. This is a 70 to 100 foot tall little hill here, and it's a sloping mound. So this is where one of the armies was, and this is where the other one was. And there you have the Valley of Elah. It's flat land now. There is a wadi that goes through it. A wadi, W-A-D-I, is a dry stream. During the rainy season, there is water there. During the dry season, there is no water there. So a man can go down to the bottom of the dry creek and find all the smooth stones he wants. Because on the bottom of a creek, when water's flowing, don't those stones just turn over themselves and over themselves and over themselves, and they become very, very smooth stones. I have those stones somewhere. I brought them back from Israel. I don't know if that's contraband or not, but they're in my house somewhere. I have set them here at the church right here before when I came back. I'll try to find them. Do we know where they are? I'll have to bring them to church so you can see a rock from the Valley of Elah, one very much like the one that impregnated the forehead of Goliath, the one who taunted Yahweh, standing on the satanic Philistine gods to protect him. Yahweh took him out with a stone. Not a sword, not a spear, a stone thrown from a young boy's sling. So the Philistines and the Jews are set up in battle array. They're ready to go. Verse 3, the Philistines stood on the mountain on one side, while Israel stood on the mountain on the other side with the valley between them. Simple as this picture right here. Each one of them is on one of the sides. Verse 4 introduces this giant. I've told you who David was. Ruddy, handsome, young, smart, poet, musician. Look at how it speaks of the giant. Then a champion came out from the armies of the Philistines named Goliath, or Goliath as we speak his name, from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. Now, a cubit is the distance from your elbow to the tip of your fingers, 18 inches or so. That means that this man Goliath stood 9 feet, 9 inches tall. That's how big he was. I mean, give or take an inch, but the math is pretty accurate. 9 feet, 9 inches tall. It would make the tallest, it'd make Shaquille O'Neal look like a small man, 2.5 feet taller than the giant Shaquille O'Neal, who I probably, if I did this, wouldn't reach the top of his head. Add 2.5 feet to that. This guy's almost touching his head, that thing up there. This is a huge man who's going to fight this little boy, teenager, that comes to him, this red-headed David, with his little sling, no armor. Amazing what happens here. 9 foot 9 inches tall, closest estimation to how big this man Goliath was. He had a bronze helmet on his head. Look at how this man came into battle when he came down into the valley. He had a bronze helmet on his head. He was clothed with a scale armor which weighed 5,000 shekels of bronze. The man had 125 pounds of bronze on him, protecting his torso. His armor weighed 125 pounds. That's more than carrying Caleb around all day. And to this man it was nothing. Look what it says. He also had bronze greaves on his legs. This is that armor that goes down from your knees down to your ankle. You've seen Romans and different people in their full steel, iron, bronze garb. This happened to be bronze. So he has these bronze greaves on his legs. He has a bronze javelin slung between his shoulders. This is a warrior, a killing machine if ever there was one. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam. Just an idea that it wasn't a little thin pole like this. It was something that a man's hand that was probably this big around grabbed a hold of something 4 or 5 inches in diameter. A gigantic piece of wood this man used as a spear. And it says the head of his spear, just the tip of it, weighed 15 pounds. The head of his spear weighed 600 shekels of iron. And he had a shield carrier that also walked before him. Again, a killing machine, if there ever was one, standing on the shoulders of his false god Dagon to protect his armies in battle, to protect him in battle. And what does he do when he comes into the field, into the valley of Elon, but taunt the armies of the living God? He taunts Yahweh and Yahweh's people Israel, and Yahweh responds. So we have in Goliath here this hulk of a man. Look at how he's been described. He's giant. He's huge, he's strong, he's powerful, he's fearless, he's intimidating, he's everything that no other man would ever want to fight, certainly not in hand-to-hand combat. This is a suicide mission, and everybody in Israel knew it except this young boy David, who had no fear at all because he had a relationship with his God. So in Goliath, we're painted this picture of a giant. And in David, the great contrast is we're painted this picture of a teenager with no hand-to-hand experience, no hand-to-hand combat battlefield experience. He's a little red-headed, fair-skinned, handsome kid compared to Goliath. Verse 8, he stood and he shouted. Listen to Goliath, this arrogant, false God worshiping Goliath. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, and he said to them, "Why do you come out to draw up in battle array? Am I not the Philistine, and you servants of Saul?" And he lays this gauntlet down for 40 days. "Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. The armies don't have to fight. I'll take on anybody you'll put in front of me." He says, if a Jewish man is able to fight with me and kill me, then we, the Philistines, will become your servants. But if I win, and he had every intention of slaughtering anybody who came to him, if I prevail against the Jew, if I kill your Jewish soldier who you send to me, then you, all Israel, shall become our servants and serve us. Verse 10 says, again, the Philistine, here's Goliath continuing. He says, the quote from Goliath, "I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." What was Israel's response to this? When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now remember things about King Saul, what the Bible has told us about King Saul. Let me ask you this question. Who was best suited to go out and fight for Israel? Who should have gone out to fight Goliath? Why? Not because he's the king, but because he's the biggest guy around. Remember, one of the things we learned about Saul early on is that from the shoulders up, he was a head and shoulders taller than any man. It would be like me standing here and Terry standing beside me. Who's going to go to battle in one-on-one combat? Terry is. Every time. What's that? Terry says Rick's going. I'm sending Terry in. Well, the biggest man in Israel, the broad-shouldered, strong, most handsome man in Israel, and the biggest guy around is Saul. And what do we hear about Saul but that he's terrified and greatly afraid? See, it's like the 12 spies, the 10 that were bad. God isn't strong enough to defeat the giants in these fortified cities. There's no way we can go in there and defeat these people. What they entirely forgot is that they were God's chosen people, and Yahweh could defeat the Philistine giant with no problem at all. And that's exactly the perspective David had coming into this battle. The battle is God's, not mine. Why should I fear a human being who taunts my God? God will respond to being taunted. I just have to stand up and do the work He calls me to do. God will fight this battle. You can't taunt the living God and get away with it. That was David's perspective. No one will win this. God will win this. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob will win this. I don't care what Jew goes out there. And if all of you men are afraid to do it, please step aside and let me through. That was the heart of David, this worshiper of the great God, Yahweh. That was his heart. Let me at him, this uncircumcised Philistine. I don't care what he looks like. I have a God who's indestructible behind me. That's King David. What a man. Can't wait to see this man in heaven. So Saul's terrified. And then we see David introduced. Now David was the son of the Ephrathite of Bethlehem in Judah, whose name was Jesse. He had 8 sons. And Jesse was old in the days of Saul. He was advanced in years among men. The 3 older sons of Jesse had gone after Saul to the battle. So Jesse's 3 first sons, his oldest sons, are on one of the mountains in the valley of Elah in the Jewish army. So the 3 sons of Jesse, the 3 oldest sons, were also among those who were dismayed and greatly afraid, right? The names of his 3 sons who went to the battle were Eliab, his firstborn. The second to him was Abinadab, and the third was Shammah. And then it says this about David: he was the youngest. He was a kid. The 3 oldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul. Remember, he had been his harp player for the last 4 or 5 years. David went back and forth from Saul to tend to his father's flock at Bethlehem. They only called David into service to play the harp for Saul when the evil spirit would come upon Saul. David didn't live with Saul. He went back and forth to Bethlehem, and he went to Gibeah where Saul was, and he would play the harp for Saul. When things calmed down with Saul and the evil spirit would leave him, we'll learn it all on Sunday, David would go back home and tend to his father's work. He was his shepherd. The Philistines, verse 16, came forward morning and evening, or the Philistine, Goliath, came forward morning and evening for 40 days and took a stand. So he didn't do this 40 times, he did it 80 times. Because he would do it first thing in the morning and he would do it in the evening. He would challenge the armies of Yahweh to battle. Send me a man. Send me a man. And then you wonder, well, how is it that this young man, 17-year-old David, how is it that he even ended up on the battlefield? Because it says the 3 older sons of Jesse had gone with Saul to the battle. How did David even get there to find out what was going on with Goliath? And the answer is, his father Jesse was concerned for his 3 oldest sons. Jesse wanted to send his son some food, and Jesse wanted to find out how his boys were doing. Same way you might. How's my son? How are my sons? It's been a while. We've gotten no news from Elah. The battle hasn't taken place. Over a month has gone by. There's still no skirmish. There's still no warfare. What is going on there? And how are my sons? He's a man who loves his boys. Jesse said to his youngest son David in verse 17, "Take now for your brothers an ephah of this roasted grain. Deliver a care package to my sons. Take for your brothers an ephah of this roasted grain and these 10 loaves and run to the camp to your brothers." He sends David to the battlefield, to the valley of Elah, to find out what's going on. He says, "Bring also these 10 cuts of cheese to the commander of their 1,000, and look into the welfare of your brothers and bring back news of them." You go, David, find out how they're doing, come back to me and tell me. We're talking a short distance, probably 7 to 10 miles from where Jesse lived to the valley of Elah, but in those days it was on foot. So that's what's happening. Jesse, the father, David's father, sends him to the battlefield because he cares for his sons. You wonder, how is it that God's going to defeat the Philistines? David would never have gone to the battlefield if his father, I'm sure motivated by God and his love for his sons, if his father wouldn't have sent him into the battlefield to take this care package to his boys. It's interesting how God does things, isn't it? It's a man's concern for his sons, and he sends David. Otherwise, we don't have this story of David and Goliath. David never goes to the battlefield, except for Jesse wanting to know what's going on. It says in verse 19, "For Saul and they and all the men of Israel are in the valley of Elah, fighting with the Philistines." I want to know what's going on. David, go find out. So what does David do? He just obeys. Kids, learn from David. He's given a command from his father, and he simply obeys. Just does it. David arose early in the morning. He left the flock with the keeper the way a good shepherd would. Isn't that an interesting statement about David? He doesn't lose his focus on what his job is as the shepherd of his father's sheep. He finds a substitute shepherd before he leaves. He cares for his job. Tells us a lot about the character of David, that he found someone to take care of his father's sheep before he left. Early in the morning, he left the flock with the keeper, and he took the supplies, and he went to as Jesse had commanded him. No questions, no negotiating. He obeyed his father. And he came to the circle of the camp while the army was going out in battle array, shouting the war cry. They're ready. But every day the war is interrupted by this Goliath who comes out and makes this one-on-one challenge. Israel and the Philistines drew up in battle array, army to army. You can see the phalanxes, the groups, the lines of battle ready to go. And every day for 40 days, Goliath would step out of line and walk forward and say, "Send someone to me." One-on-one. That's what David walks up to. Battle about to take place. David left his baggage in the care of the baggage keeper. Again, responsible David. He leaves his baggage in the care of the baggage keeper, and he ran to the battle line, and he entered in order to greet his brothers, who obviously would be lined up for battle also. As he was talking with them, behold, the champion, the Philistine from Gath, named Goliath, was coming up from the army of the Philistines, and he spoke these same words, and David heard them. For the first time, David heard the taunting of Goliath. Send me a man. If he kills me, we'll serve you. If I kill him, you'll serve us. David hears it for the first time on this day. David heard the words of Goliath. When all the men of Israel saw the man Goliath, they fled from him and were greatly afraid, including David's brothers. The men of Israel said, "Have you seen this man who is coming up?" I mean, horrified, terrified by this gigantic human being. Have you seen this man? Who in the world could face him? Surely he's coming up to defy Israel. Look at the perspective of the Jews. They think Goliath is taunting Israel. David understands that Goliath is taunting Israel's God, Yahweh. Perspective is off. That surely he's coming up to defy Israel, and it will be that the king will enrich. Now this is what Saul has given forth as a challenge to any Jew crazy enough to fight Goliath. It will be that the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches. Look at what he's going to give him. He's going to make the killer of Goliath rich. The king is also going to give the killer of Goliath one of his own daughters. And he's going to make his father's house, he's going to make the killer of Goliath, whatever Jewish man kills Goliath, his father's house will be free in Israel. You know what that means? Free of what? Free of what? Free of taxes. Free of taxes. You will never pay the kingdom again. You will live free of all encumbrance. You will live tax-free. Imagine that. Boy, everybody'd stand in line for that, wouldn't they? Imagine how much more money you'd have in a year's time if you didn't pay any tax. That's what making his father's house free means here. Tax-free. But again, the Israelite army is interpreting Goliath's threats as a threat against the people of Israel. It's David who understood truly that Goliath's threats were against Israel's God, Yahweh. He is taunting the living God. He's taunting Yahweh Sabaoth, the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies. He's not taunting the armies, people. He's taunting our God. That is what David brought to the battlefield. He's taunting our God. Then David spoke to the men who were standing by him, and he said, "What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine?" Remember, circumcision was a mark God gave Abraham that every Jew would be circumcised in the foreskin of his flesh. This man doesn't worship our God Yahweh. He's not one of us. He's uncircumcised. He's a pagan, non-Yahweh worshiper. Why are we afraid of him? Who could possibly be afraid of him when we have Yahweh on our side? And that's David's charge. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine? I have no fear of this man. I stand on the shoulders of the living God. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he, this pagan, should taunt the armies of Yahweh, the living God? Not the dead false gods of Satan, but the one true and living God, Yahweh. Who is this uncircumcised pagan that he has the gall to come before Yahweh's chosen people and challenge Yahweh like this? That's what David says. That's what he means by this uncircumcised Philistine who's taunting the armies of the living God. David wants to know, tell me again, what is it that Saul is offering? He's heard it, but he wants to hear it again. The people answered him in accord with this word, and they said, thus it will be done for the man who kills him. He's going to live tax-free. He's going to be rich. He's going to get one of the king's daughters as his own wife. And we'll pick up here next time. But the oldest of his brothers in anger and jealousy speaks up. Eliab, the oldest of the brothers of David, speaks up. And he says, what are you doing here? Why have you come down here, and with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? He's accusing him of not being a good shepherd. You probably abandoned the sheep, but he didn't. The story tells us he didn't. He left it with a sheep herder. And then Eliab says, I know your insolence. I know the wickedness of your heart. It's Eliab that's insolent and has wickedness in his heart. But he accuses his little brother David of these things. He says, for you have come down in order to see the battle. And we'll try to figure out next time, and we'll finish the story. Why is Eliab so mad at his little brother David? Let me offer this just so you can chew on it. In 1 Samuel chapter 16, when David was 12 years old and Samuel went to Jesse's house, remember Eliab was the man who came up first, and this is the oldest son whom Samuel said this of him, surely the Lord's anointed is before me. Surely it's this one, this big, strong, firstborn son of Jesse. Surely it's him that I've come to anoint king of Israel. And Eliab is right in front of Samuel when God says, you are looking on the outward appearance, but I look on the heart. I have rejected him as being king. Eliab is in the presence of Samuel and all his brothers when Samuel tells him very clearly, it's not you, please step aside. He's the oldest firstborn son in a Jewish family. To him belongs the birthright. To him belongs a double portion. To him belongs the honor of his father's house. And Eliab has been pushed aside for the young 12-year-old shepherd boy. And just like Joseph's brothers had some envy and jealousy and hatred toward him, here we have Eliab and his brothers who have a jealousy and a hatred toward their brother David. Some things never change, do they? Here we have Jews fighting within their family, brother against brother, yet again, same story. Eliab tries to brace his brother. We'll finish the story next time. We're into it. Let's close in prayer.